Good afternoon. Welcome to Soldiers Memorial for this very special author event that we have today with Mr. Rick Beyer. First off, I want to thank all of the members of the Missouri Historical Society. Goes without saying, but we can't do the work that we do without your support. Very grateful for all that you do. Very grateful for our volunteers. You've met some of them today. There's always volunteer opportunities here at Soldiers Memorial and the Missouri History Museum and the Library and Research Center, so if that's something you're interested in, please see me afterwards. I can get you the information you need. I also want to thank the Soldiers Memorial Giving Circle. So these are the members that go just a little step further, contributing directly here to Soldiers Memorial. We're certainly grateful for your additional support. I don't want to go on too long because I'm the least interesting person in the room today. But I want to introduce Mr. Rick Beyer. Rick is a best-selling author, award-winning documentary filmmaker, and a longtime history enthusiast. He's co-author with Liz Sayles of the New York Times bestseller, The Ghost Army of World War II, How One Top Secret Unit Deceived the Enemy Using Inflatable Tanks, Sound Effects, and Other Audacious Fakery. And those books, we don't have as many as we wish we'd had, but we will be selling those books after the presentation. You can get it, you can purchase a book, and Rick will sign the book for you. The book details the story of a top-secret group of World War II GIs who staged a traveling roadshow of deception on the battlefields of Europe. Rick also made an award-winning documentary film about the unit, The Ghost Army, which premiered on PBS in 2013. And I know some of you in this room have sat in this very room and watched that documentary with us. It does an incredible job of telling the story. And I would say that the book, it takes it even one step further. It's just fantastic. He's also produced documentary films for the History Channel, A&E, National Geographic, the Smithsonian, and others. He's the author of the popular Greatest Stories Never Told series of history books published by HarperCollins. He has also worked as a radio reporter, a TV news producer, and an ad agency creative director, and a janitor, but not in that order, right, Rick? A graduate of Dartmouth College, Rick lives in Chicago with his beautiful wife, Marilyn. Marilyn, I believe, where is she? Where is she? There she is. Rick and Marilyn are down from Chicago. He's been a friend of Soldiers Memorial as well. I really can't express enough gratitude. This topic, the exhibit, if you haven't seen it yet, is on the lower level, so get down there and see it after the presentation if you have not. But it was new to most of us, as it is new to most of you, I believe. But Rick has been there, a true friend, answering questions that we can't answer, that our docents receive on guided tours. Every now and then there's that question we just don't know, and Rick has been our go-to guy to get us those answers. Been great. He was here on Labor Day weekend, visited with all of our docents and the staff, and kind of spent some time with us, introducing us and giving us a deep dive into the story. So we were prepared to host this exhibit, which travels to us from the World War II Museum, which is in New Orleans. Again, we'll sell the book immediately following the presentation. Rick has agreed to sign the book. So queue up in the middle aisle there. I know some of you have brought your books to be signed. So if you queue up in the middle aisle, and we'll sell them here at the table. And then, of course, visit the exhibition afterwards. You have plenty of time. We don't close until 5. If you haven't seen our core galleries yet, it tells the story of St. Louis in service from the American Revolution all the way up through today. So there's plenty to see there, as well as the special exhibition. Whoa, that's long enough, Rick. It's your turn. Mr. Rick Beyer.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, but I have to say, first of all, before I start my talk, I want to just introduce a couple of people, because I started working on the Ghost Army, as I'll mention, 20 years ago, but there's somebody in this room who started working on it almost 30 years ago. His name is Richard Chapman. Richard, where are you? You have to stand up, because he wrote a screenplay. He's here with his beautiful wife, Nancy. He wrote a Ghost Army screenplay almost 30 years ago, one of something like 200 projects that he's been involved in. So he knew about the Ghost Army long before it was even a gleam in my eye. But he did not know about it as long as Alice, where are you? Alice, are you here? Alice, stand up, whose dad was in the Ghost Army. Yeah. So she's probably the person in the room who has known about the story the longest. And I also have to say, Mike J., where are you? I'm going to point out Mike J. is the nephew of Ghost Army veteran Arthur Shilstone, who I'll mention. So I'm so honored that all these folks, as well as some people, yes, thank you. As well as some people who've been on my tours are here. I'm not going to embarrass you guys by naming you out there. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. 80 years ago, 1944, you're a soldier, and you get your orders. You're headed to the front. It's during the biggest event in human history, World War II. You're headed to the front, but you're not going to be firing an M1 rifle or driving a Sherman tank. Your mission is to put on a show for the enemy. You must stage a complex multimedia presentation spread out over many miles and do so right in the middle of a war zone. It must be utterly convincing to an attentive and discerning audience that wants nothing more than to kill you, which I hope is not the mood of this audience today. Your life and thousands of other lives depend on how good a job you do, and next week you're going to be asked to do it again. And that, in a nutshell, is the mission handed to the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a really boring name for one of the most remarkable units in military history. And to carry it off, they used inflatable tanks, sound effects, and all sorts of forms of illusion. And did so right on the battlefield, right under fire from the enemy. Maybe you've already seen the exhibit. Maybe you've seen the documentary film. I can tell you, with all the time I've spent on this, the deeper you get into this story, the more fascinating it is. Now, I first came across this story 20 years ago. January will mark the 20th anniversary of my time on the Ghost Army. I was much younger looking when I started. And I met a woman, her name was Martha Gavin, whose uncle was in the unit. His name is John Jarvie. We'll see him at one point in the presentation. And I met her at a Starbucks. We'd been introduced, and I met her, and she walked into the Starbucks, and she was carrying an armload of red 3-ring binders. In my mind's eye, they piled up higher than her head. That may be an exaggeration. And those were her uncle's wartime scrapbooks. And so I'm sitting there at this Starbucks coffee shop, leafing through the scrapbooks. Some of the items in those scrapbooks are in the exhibit downstairs. So it ties right back to that very first day about this. And so I was immediately hooked. And I had never heard of this, right? I had heard of the famous D-Day deception, Operation Fortitude. Some of you may have thought you were coming to hear about Operation Fortitude today. Sorry, we're not going there, but this is an even better story. That was a British-run deception to fool the Germans about where the D-Day landings would take place. This is a completely different story. This is 1,100 American soldiers carrying on a traveling roadshow of deception up and down the front lines. I think they did 22 different deceptions starting in June 1944 and going to March 1945. And operating on the battlefield in France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany. I could be missing a country, but they operated in all those places. And I was blown away. Blown away, first of all, by the idea of weaponizing creativity and using it in a war. Blown away, secondly, by the fact that this unit had such a great impact and completely escaped being in the history books. And I have to tell you, for a filmmaker, that's a gold mine. A great story with great people to talk about it that had a big impact, and somehow nobody has made that documentary film before. I dived right into it. That was the inspiration that led me to make the Ghost Army documentary, which is still available on Amazon, to co-author with Elizabeth Sales the Ghost Army book, and to help try to get this unit honored the way it should be honored, which I will talk about. And I've had a lot of success with the Ghost Army, and I'd like to say that this has come about basically because I am a genius storyteller, and everything I touch turns to gold. Sadly, experience says that's not the case. But the truth is that this is an amazing story. It's one that I've been lucky about to learn literally from the mouths of the soldiers who carried it out, and that I am honored to share with you today. So let's get right into it. What was their mission? Their mission was deception, and in particular, these deceptions involved impersonation, impersonating other much larger units to fool the enemy about where those units were and where they were headed. Let me give you an example. I'm going to take the mic. I'm going to go rogue here. I warned him I was going rogue. Let's just assume that almost all of you guys are now in the 75th Infantry Division. Congratulations, okay? And you are going to be attacking the Germans off in this direction. But we don't know about that. So we're going to take the people in the front 2 rows over here, just you guys, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of you, and you are going to pretend to be all of them, with all of their weapons and their tanks and everything they've got, and you're going to make it look like you're about to attack the Germans in this direction. And what do we think is going to happen? Well, what we hope is going to happen is that the Germans will move their troops over to here because they think that's where you're attacking. So that when the rest of you attack over in this direction, you can do so with a greater chance of victory and fewer casualties. And that is why we do deception. They did, as I said, 22 different deceptions. This is the cover of their official history. This is a document that's in the National Archives. It was classified until 1996. You can see the crossed out classification markers. Around the edges of this are the insignia of every unit that they impersonated or were attached to. And if you're trying to count them in a hurry, there's 36 of them there. So these guys really got around. Now, how did they do it? Well, they were a multimedia deception unit, and they went to war with 3 kinds of deception: visual, sonic, and radio. And what they're probably best known for is the visual deception, the inflatable tanks that were used on the battlefield. Here's an example. This is actually a replica of one of the inflatables that they used. Here's what one of the real ones looked like. They had hundreds of these, but not just inflatable tanks. They had inflatable everything that an infantry division or an armored division would have, including inflatable artillery. I think this is a 155 millimeter gun. Inflatable artillery of every description. They had inflatable trucks. Hey, how many trucks are in this picture? 3. 3 is a good answer because 2 of them are in bags. 0 is also a good answer because none of them is a truck. All right? So they had inflatable trucks. They even had inflatable spotter planes that because every infantry or an armored division has a couple of spotter planes, they could set up fake runways and fool the Germans that way. Now, I know you're looking at this and you are thinking, that doesn't look real to me. That's not going to fool the Germans. Well, this is a little closer than we're going to be letting the Germans get. And when you get a little bit farther away, it's a little bit harder to tell which one's real. Which one's real? Shout it out, left or right? Okay, so most of you got it. It is the one on the left that's real. But this is still closer than we're going to let the Germans get. And if you have hundreds of these, you can paint the landscape with a 3D masterpiece. Here is a photo from an actual operation conducted by the Ghost Army in March of 1945. Every vehicle in this photo is inflated. All right? Now, every vehicle. I want to teach you a lesson about deception in case you want to incorporate it into your personal or professional lives. And what is it that makes this look so real? The tracks, right? So it turns out that if you have a 40-ton Sherman tank, It makes a deep impression in the ground. If you have a 90-pound dummy, not so much. And so they had to have, they had a combat engineering company, they had bulldozers that when they're setting up those inflatable tanks at night, they're also making the tracks to each one. Now, if you miss one tank and the enemy flies over in the morning, you're going to give them a clue that can unravel the whole deception. So the lesson is that attention to detail is critical, and that really runs through everything that the Ghost Army did. Now, many of the veterans who were in this unit shared with me their stories of working with these inflatables on the battlefield. I'd like to let them tell you about it.
It was a little bundle of stuff, which a tank was in, all compressed before you opened the bundle, spread the nozzles around, and inflated it.
Pulling this amorphic shape out of it, and then watching it being filled with air and taking form, like a monster.
If things went very well, there were air compressors. If things went not so well, there were bicycle pumps. And if things went terribly badly, there were our lungs.
In most cases, like a German tank, we could have it inflated and moved within 15 or 20 minutes.
The artillery piece was good. The Jeep was good. But that M4 tank, that was the beauty. That was a piece of work, it really was.
Yeah, so I talked to a lot of these guys about their experience working with inflatables, and of course they had some incredible stories. And one of them was told to me by Mike Jay's uncle, Arthur Shilstone. And it was early on in the war, and they were setting up the inflatables for one of the first times. They had put up a security perimeter around, right, to keep prying eyes away. But somehow a couple of Frenchmen on bicycles got through the security perimeter, and Arthur's on guard duty, so his job is to shoo them away. And he, as he told me the story, he said, they weren't looking at me, they were looking over my shoulder, and what they thought they saw was 4 GIs lifting a 40-ton Sherman tank and turning it around. And he said they were looking at me, they were looking for answers, and finally I said, the Americans are very strong. All right, but that's visual deception. So that's the first type of deception that they relied on. The second type was sonic deception. This involves using recorded sounds to fool the enemy. This is something that was made possible by technological advances in the years leading up to World War II. What they did is they went down to took a sound truck down to the Army Proving Ground at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And there they recorded all sorts of sounds, just like you would record a hit record. They had a turntable and they're cutting records of these sounds. Not war sounds, but sounds of preparation. Trucks on the road, tanks going uphill, tanks going downhill, men digging in, whatever. And then for any particular deception, they would mix the right sounds to tell that story onto a wire. And you were like, wait a minute, I'm sorry, what? A wire? Well, before we had cassette recorders, we had tape recorders. Before we had tape recorders, we had wire recorders where you record onto magnetized wire. I brought a wire with me, and you're not going to be able to see it probably, but still, I have it with me. And this is it. And I don't know if you can see this, but I'm going to come to this woman right here. She's going to tell you if there really is a wire. She's got it. Oh, it just broke. But there was a wire. Oh my God, this is historic. Hi, Laura. And so they would play the sounds. Now this is really theater of the mind. Imagine that you are a German soldier fighting across the world. You are listening in the dark as the sounds of tanks moving in to the area across the world. You're going to start believing what those tanks are doing. That's what officers was said that after a while, he began to see tanks. He knew they weren't there, but well, wait a minute, maybe there is a real tank. What's going on? He began to see tanks, and he said it was psychologically unnerving. Although I have to say, Dick described himself to me as a kid from the Bronx, so when he said psychologically unnerving, what he actually said was psychologically unnerving. Okay, so sonic deception. The third type of deception they went to war with is radio deception. And radio deception, very simple idea, replicate the radio signals of a real unit to make it seem like it's really there.
Radio was the stage setter. Now, when you think of the 23rd Special Troops, you think of the inflatable tank or the sound guys, and they're great. But they have to have a stage on which to perform. And we provided that stage.
So radio is the stage setter because think about it. Visual deception is only going to work if the enemy's got a church tower or an airplane to view it. Sonic deception, they have to be within hearing range. Radio deception, you can start 50 miles away and move into an area. All you need is to have all the radio trucks that a real division would have. I don't know exactly how many that is, but let's say it's about 30, and they can move into an area, and to the enemy who's listening in, it will seem like an American unit is really moving into that area. Now, radio is simple in the idea. It's complex in execution. Why? Well, they're sending Morse code. And the German intelligence folks are so sophisticated that they can identify individual American operators by their fist, their sending style, the speed they're sending out, where they make mistakes, etc. So the Ghost Army operators had to be able to impersonate the radio operators. And Malcolm Gladwell says you can't do it, but I think that they succeeded. They succeeded in doing that during World War II. So if you run into Malcolm, let him know that. I'm sure he'd be delighted to hear it. But that's the idea behind radio deception. And one of the radio deceivers was a guy named Stanley Nance, and that's Stanley right there. And Stanley is a part of the exhibit downstairs. You can see a few things related to him, including a little pennant he made for this truck, which he nicknamed Kilowatt Command. And Stanley told me, I interviewed him for the film, and he told me how he would pull the truck up next to the radio truck of the real operator that he's impersonating. It's a three-part process. He'd listen to the real operator for a while, figure out how to impersonate him. Then he'd sit down at the real operator's radio truck and send for a while, real stuff. And then the real operator would move away. He'd shut down his truck, drive away. Stanley would turn on his truck and start sending from his own truck and taking over. And to the Germans, it just seems like it's continuing on, but now the real unit is moving in a different direction. So the deception has already begun there. Stanley, I interviewed Stanley in 2005, 2006 maybe, and I interviewed him in Las Vegas. And he was a guy who had a very good sense of humor, but he was very straight-faced. And we were making conversation before the interview. I said, do you have any children? He said, yes, I have 7 sons. Well, I said, okay, that's quite fascinating. Yes, and every one of them has 7 sisters. So I said, you have 14 children? Yes, he said. I said, how many grandchildren? 53. How many great-grandchildren? And I think at that time the answer was 103. And I said, because I am a nasty person, I said, can you name them? And he said, yes, but I'd have to go in order. I said, okay, I'm going to just believe you, and we'll leave it at that. This is Stanley 4 years ago. Oh, no, that's Stanley in the war. This is Stanley 4 years ago at the National World War II Museum for the opening of the Ghost Army exhibit. And he's being pushed by his great-granddaughter. He died at age 103 3 years ago. So, okay, you got these 3 types of deception. On D-Day, June 6th, the Allies land on the beaches of Normandy. And within weeks, the Ghost Army soldiers had started carrying out deceptions. Now, Deception in war is as old as the Trojan horse, but the Ghost Army represented something unique, and it was in essence the first mobile, multimedia, tactical deception unit in the history of war. I said that deception's been around since the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse worked great that first time. It wouldn't have worked so well the second time because the enemy would have been onto it. The idea with this unit was that they could do deception after deception, and if they carry them off correctly, the enemy never knows that they've been operating against them. So you might ask, and many people do, who dreamed up this idea? Well, the answer is that it came from a marriage of opposites, Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris. And Ralph Ingersoll was a flamboyant, left-wing celebrity journalist and author. The New York Times called him a prodigiously energetic egotist. He wrote books, he had founded a newspaper in New York, PM, very famous guy. He was a genuinely creative thinker with a penchant for, how should I say this, embellishing the truth. Here's how a fellow officer said it: "I've never met anyone who was such a bright guy who was such a goddamn liar." Which is a great pedigree for a deception officer, right? Because you're smart and you're a good liar. So he was drafted into the Army, and now in 1943, he's a staff officer working on deception plans in London. His boss there at the Special Plans Branch is Billy Harris. Billy Harris is a button-down West Point guy. His dad was a general. His brother was a general. Billy became a general. Look, their family is so military. I am not making this up. Billy Harris's mother introduced Dwight Eisenhower to Mamie Dowd, okay? That's how embedded in the military his family was. Now, these two guys, under other circumstances, might never even have had a cup of coffee together. But thrown together by war, they formed a great partnership. Ingersoll was the pie in the sky, wild idea, let's try this guy. And Harris was the feet on the ground. How do we make this work with the resources we have? And together, they created the Ghost Army. They were inspired, fair enough to say they were inspired by British deception efforts in North Africa, a deception called Operation Bertram, a very important inspiration. But they dreamed up this idea and then sold it to the brass. And I love this story because I think it really is an example of something we forget about today, which is the power of collaborating with somebody who thinks differently than you do, right? And so that can create friction, but friction can create heat, create a spark, and ignite an idea. And I think it did in this case. So as I said, they went to war armed with three types of deception: visual, sonic, and radio. But once they're in action, they realize they're missing something. And it's not the brass who figures it out. Is it ever the brass? Well, okay, maybe sometimes it is, right? But in this case, it was the junior officers and enlisted men. And a young lieutenant named Fred Fox put his finger on it. He said, "We need to be more theatrical." And that is what led to a fourth dimension of deception, which they called special effects, which involved turning every one of them into actors.
Moving through the French villages so recently occupied by the Germans, they saw an opportunity to improvise yet another way to sell their deceptions, targeting enemy spies that might have stayed behind. They called it special effects.
Why don't we put a stencil of the name of the unit that we were simulating right on the trucks? And why don't we start a counterfeit shoulder patch factory where they would see we were the 75th Division, one of the divisions we did?
So we began to put on their patches and put their bumper markings on, and we physically assumed the role. Only for every 100 of them, there might be 10 of us.
My shirts were all wrecked from having sewn so many different shoulder patches on them.
They even set up phony command posts, and against all Army regulations, staffed them with counterfeit commanders.
If you're going to bring a division up, you better have a headquarters somewhere. and there better be a major general walking around. And so we had to have a full general do this. Some sergeant would wear 2 stars for an operation.
Our job was to go in with our phony markings and phony stories that we were pretending to be officers and soldiers from another organization. And we were turned loose in town. Go to the pub, order some omelets, and talk loose.
And a lot of the guys went to the bakery, got rolls and stuff, and said, "We got to get an extra supply because we're moving out tonight," that kind of thing.
It was almost kind of silly, really. But I think what really confirmed the fact that there was effectiveness was sitting in a cafe and seeing a door open up gradually and somebody was taking pictures.
We'd find out if, like, a division or a special unit had a particular song that they liked to sing. We get blitzed and sing their song.
Threw themselves into their work, as you can see. I want to just stop for a minute and say, this is a real story. Can I just remind you again? This isn't fiction. This happened on the battlefields of Europe during World War II. To me, sometimes you get so deeply involved in this and you're laughing about it, and it's like, this all really happened. I mean, it is absolutely incredible. One of the veterans mentioned that they set up a counterfeit shoulder patch factory. Here are some of the fake patches, and they are in the exhibit. This page is in the exhibit. It's a page from a scrapbook created by Seymour Nussenbaum, who was a fantastic scrapbook maker and who sadly died at age 101 just about a month ago. And Seymour estimated they made 40,000 of these patches. And why did they make them instead of getting them from the Army? Well, they couldn't get them fast enough. You know, you got a deception, you got to start it on Tuesday. You need patches, you're going to make your own. They painted them onto tent canvas and sewed them onto their uniforms, and it was convincing enough. All right, so they used these 4 types of deception together in 22 deceptions, you know, each one trying to set up a phony story of where a unit was headed, of what's going on, to fool the enemy, to try to get them to move resources, to do things the way we wanted them to be done. And these deceptions include deceptions during the clearing of Brittany, Patton's race across France, the Battle of the Bulge, and the crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945. And that last operation, Operation Viersen, was probably their most successful operation. They were impersonating 2 different divisions, the 30th and the 79th. And the 30th and the 79th were going to cross the Rhine River here, but the Ghost Army was trying to make it seem like they were crossing here. So the Germans built up their troops here, and the real units crossed with very minimal casualties. And this mission alone is believed to have saved thousands of lives. Now, many of the operations of the Ghost Army were for this man, General George Patton, commander of the 3rd Army. They did not work for Patton. They worked for his boss, Omar Bradley, but they carried out a lot of deceptions for the 3rd Army. Now, we all have this image of Patton in our heads. He's got the ivory-handled pistols. He's profane. He's difficult. He's headstrong. He's obnoxious. The deception planners had a very different view of him. Here's what Billy Harris said about him. He was the greatest team player that we ran into over there. He would do anything you asked him to in the interest of the overall picture. That is very different than the way we think of Patton, and I think it's a window on his generalship. He wanted to win. He knew that deception could help make that happen, and he embraced it. Now, a top-secret report years after the war categorized the exploits of the Ghost Army this way: rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. And then they hushed it up for decades. They came home and kept quiet about it. I really do think that they're the unsung heroes of World War II. Now, there's another aspect to this story, and you'll see it in the exhibit downstairs. When the U.S. Army created the 23rd, it had to put it together in a hurry. And so they took various units that were already in existence, and they mashed them together to form the 23rd. And to handle the visual deception, the inflatable tanks, they selected the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. This was a unit filled with artists. About half the unit were artists. One of the sergeants in the unit, a guy named Harold Dahl, referred to them as the art boys. And so when they went to France, the guys in this unit who were artists painted and sketched their way across the battlefield. It wasn't part of their job. It was what they did in their spare time. They painted each other. They painted orphan children. They painted bombed out churches, whatever they could find. And this began as soon as they arrived in Normandy.
A few miles from the Ghost Army's first bivouac was the Normandy village of Trevière. The artists were drawn to a bombed-out church off the town square.
These were some of the first sketches I did. They were not too long after the invasion. In the remains of this church, we might have had 3 or 4 guys in there sketching. We were sleeping in hedgerows and foxholes, but nothing kept us away from going someplace to do a watercolor.
I was not the only soldier with a sketchbook. I'd have sketched whether I was the only soldier or not, but to be quite honest with you, I think it helped keep me in balance. I think it kept my sanity.
In the ruins of this church in Trevière, the soldiers were painting and sketching there. We have a photo of Alice, of your dad, Ed Baccia, in that church. And one of the little children of the town came in to see the soldiers, and one of the children was a boy named Paul Gravet, and he was sketched, drawn here by an artist named John Hapgood. Well, Marilyn and I have been back to Trevière many times, and Paul Gravet, his family is still there, but he lived elsewhere. But he came back. He came back to Trevière, and so we got to meet the boy in the painting. And a very exciting moment. And Paul Gravet, we had already sent him the painting, so he had it, a copy of it, not the original. And when we got to Normandy, he really wanted to give me a gift. He was very excited. We're staying at the same B&B. And he pulled out this box and he handed it to me. And he said, "I am a Norman guy. I am from Normandy. We're in Normandy. I am giving you a gift that came all the way from America." So I said, okay, and I opened the box, and the first thing on top is a little platform, which he had made. I took the platform out, and I put it down. And then I pulled out the rest of the thing that was in the box, and this is what it is. Okay, I'm going to hold this up. I don't know if you can see this. It's metal. It's very heavy. It's jagged. Does anybody know what it is? This is a piece of shrapnel. This was likely fired by the USS Texas at the church in Trevière on D-Day. Paul Gravet found it as a small boy. I think he was 10 or 11. He found it in the rubble in the church the day that they made that painting. He put it in a shoebox under his bed. He lived across the street from the church. Once they came back to the town, once they could live there again. And he kept it for 75 years, and then he gave it to me. And he gave another one to my co-author, Elizabeth Sales. And it's very special to me. And one of the reasons it's special is, how often do you get to hold a piece of D-Day in your hands? Well, for you guys, today is that day, because I'm going to hand this to you, and you're going to pass it around, and I hope I'm going to get it back, because every other audience I've dealt with has given it back so far. And some people take it and they think it's like, they're holding it like it's a precious jewel. And I say, somebody already fired that out of a cannon into a church respectfully, I don't think there's that much you can do with it. But as you guys are looking at that, talking about the artists, many of the artists in this unit had amazing post-war careers, and some of them went on to become quite famous. Among those, the fashion designer Bill Blass was in this unit. Kid from Indiana, 21-year-old kid from Indiana. He's sketching like everybody else, but what is he sketching? He's sketching women's fashions. And that is his wartime scrapbook. And if you look at the cover of the scrapbook in the upper left, you'll see that he's penciled in the mirror image bees that become the logo of his fashion empire. So he is already thinking about that. Ellsworth Kelly, the very famous minimalist painter and sculptor, I know he's got works in St. Louis. This is one of his works from the time of the war, very different from his post-war hard-edged, color on black and on white work, minimalist work, but this is an example of what he was doing in the war. Arthur Singer, who was a wildlife artist and who, if any of you are birders and you have the book Birds of North America, Arthur Singer illustrated that, and along with many other birding books, and he also, he and one of his sons created the Birds and Flowers of the 50 States postage stamp series. I also want to make a mention of the man in the right on this photo, and that's Alice's dad, Ed Baccia, who is sketching in the church in Treviere. And it was said of him that in Europe he never stopped painting and drawing. He used art supplies his mother sent from home. He painted in foxholes and cafes, and then he rolled them up and mailed them back to his mother. And honestly, until today, I had never seen any of his wartime art, but some of it is in the exhibit downstairs. So I really, thanks to Alice, and I really think you should look at that. In 1951, he was appointed the assistant dean of the School of Fine Arts at Wash U. And 3 years later, he resigned from his administrative post, and he took up a job as an assistant professor of drawing so he could focus on his own drawing and painting work. And according to his obituary in the St. Louis Dispatch, he would say, "I started at the top and worked my way down." He was a professor there until 1986 when he retired. He was a prolific artist, creating something like 1,400 paintings in his lifetime, including, if you've ever been to the Catholic Student Center at Wash U, that great painting behind the altar there is by Ed Baccia. And his work is in the collection of many museums, including the St. Louis Art Museum, the Denver Art Museum, the St. Louis University Museum of Art, other museums, 600 private collections. And I think the best thing here, after he retired from the university, he took up poetry, right? So, and he was a success at that too. Don't those people really annoy you when they can be good at so many things? There are many other people in the unit who I can't mention them all, who had lengthy careers as designers, illustrators, architects, set designers. One of the things that's a goal of mine in the next few years, whether I get to it or not, would be to curate an art exhibit where we could bring together the art, wartime and post-war art of so many of these artists and travel it around the country, because I think that would be a wild success. Last fall, I finished up our 4th Ghost Army tour of Europe. This is an advertisement. Our 5th tour is this year, this coming year, next fall. It's done under the auspices of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. There's their website, stephenambrosetours.com. We start in England and we end up in Germany. We trace the route of the Ghost Army. And one of the stops we make is at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg. 5,076 GIs are buried there under rows of gleaming white crosses. Now, up at the front of the cemetery is one of the most famous generals of World War II. We've already talked about him today, General George Patton. He was killed in a car accident shortly after the war was over. And his grave is a tourist attraction. People come out of the buses, they stand around his grave, and the tour guide speaks to them. I have done it myself. Way in the back of the cemetery, there's another George, okay? not so many people visit his grave. His name was George Peddle, and he was a radio operator for the 23rd, one of those guys sending out fake radio messages designed to attract enemy attention. And he did it all too well in March 1945. During Operation Bougainville, George Peddle was hit by enemy artillery. They launched an artillery attack just as the operation was ending. The guys were in their trucks, literally about to drive away. George Peddle was hit with a piece of shrapnel. And now that you've held a piece of shrapnel in your hand, you might have a different sense of what that means than you would have otherwise. People went to help him. He said, "Don't bother, I'm going to die," which he did. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed during the war. About 30 were seriously wounded, carrying out these deceptions. And George Peddle's grave is a sobering reminder that although this story has its whimsical aspects, that men bled and died to carry out these deceptions. I see somebody looking at their watch. I am getting to the end, okay? Fear not, okay? 80 years later, the World War II generation is slipping away. And to my knowledge, there are only 5 men left of the 1,100 who served in this unit. And all too soon, the Ghost Army will be an army of ghosts. And I don't want this story to die with them, which is why I made the documentary and I wrote the book and I founded a nonprofit, the Ghost Army Legacy Project, to preserve and honor the legacy of this unit. And we've done a bunch of different things, but probably the most important one was seek official recognition of this unit, long denied because their story was kept secret for so many years. And in 2015, we launched a campaign to secure the unit a Congressional Gold Medal. This is the highest honor that Congress can bestow. It's been used to honor a number of other military units. It's not a military medal, it's a civilian medal. But it has been used to honor military units that were not honored at the time they operated for whatever different reasons. This is the first Congressional Gold Medal that was awarded. It went to George Washington in 1776. So that kind of sets the standard for what this medal is about. I think there's been about 175 of them awarded over the last 250 years. But to award this medal, you have to get Congress to pass legislation. And I know that you guys, some of you read the papers and listen to the news, and you probably have an idea that passing legislation through the divided Congress that we've had the past number of years is very difficult. But as difficult as it is, a gold medal bill is even harder because you have to get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to co-sponsor the bill. So each of those congressmen, 67 senators, 290 congressmen have to be so convinced that this is worth doing that they will put their names on that bill, not just vote for it, but sign on as a co-sponsor before it can even be considered. And by the way, Congress operates in 2-year sessions. Every time you get to the end of a session, you have to start over again. Okay? So some people told us that it would be impossible to do this if we didn't have the support of the leadership in Congress, if we didn't have big money or a celebrity or something. But we just decided to set out and give it a try. And it took 7 years, but we managed to do it. And we did it with the lobbying help of a bunch of people. And this is just a few of the people who were involved in our lobbying. You know, Alice, who's here, was also involved in the lobbying, many, many other people. Just to point out in this group, I think it's really worth noting, 3 teenagers who were really important to our lobbying. Second from the left is Reese Holmes. Next to her in the red is Madeline Christensen, who's the great-granddaughter of Stanley Nance. On the right is Caleb Sinwell there with Senator Grassley. And these were all teenagers who had done Ghost Army history projects and were excited about the story. And they were a big help. They got us a lot of people, especially in the closing days of this effort. And so finally, the president signed the bill on February 1st, 2022. That was a big day for me. I got to tell you, my heart was bursting out of its seams on that day. And then the Mint went to work designing the medal because it's a custom designed medal, and you can see the front and back of the medal down in the exhibit. You can also see it right here. And that was a 2-year design process. You cannot hurry the Mint. That's another lesson I've learned from this story. And you can see on the left the 4 types of deception are depicted on the medal. On the right is the unofficial insignia of the 23rd, and down here is the unofficial insignia of the 3133rd that operated independently as a deception unit in Italy. Okay, they're a very tiny part of the exhibit downstairs, but you think you can find some information about them. So, in March of this year, Congress officially presented the gold medal to the Ghost Army. And 600 people gathered under the expansive dome of the U.S. Capitol for a ceremony hosted by Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. And this was a day that I had worked toward for many years. And now the leadership of the U.S. Congress and the U.S. military were there to honor these men. And it was deeply moving to me to sit in the front row and listen as the leaders from the House and Senate championed these soldiers whose cause I took up 20 years ago.
We gather today to pay homage and to honor the legacy of a group of covert, creative, and courageous American war heroes who guarded truth and our precious troops with righteous deception.
When our troops were near, this group made the enemy believe they were far away, and when we were small, they made the enemy believe we were much larger.
A story of commitment and resolve, bravery and devotion, and remarkable talent and ingenuity.
These secret soldiers were innovators, and they played a decisive role in turning the tide and winning the war.
At great personal risk, these soldiers successfully diverted enemy resources and, as we have heard today, saved tens of thousands of American lives.
So my colleagues and I introduced the legislation to recognize and honor the Ghost Army with colleagues from both sides of the aisle and from both chambers. And that same bipartisanship is here today. It's no small feat to get all these congressional leaders in this room together, smiling and in agreement. It's like a political Haley Comet. But the heroes of the Ghost Army and their families are used to defying their surroundings for the sake of making history.
I want to share one other picture from this day. As you saw, we had 3 Ghost Army veterans who were there. I took this picture in the holding room before we all went out to take part in the ceremony. And seated from left to right here are John Chrisman, Bernie Bluestein, and Seymour Nussenbaum. And kneeling on the ground to talk to them are, from left to right, General Charles Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Christine Wormuth, the Secretary of the Army, and General Randy George, the Chief of Staff of the United States Army. And this, look, there were a lot of politicians in this room who also talked to the soldiers of the Ghost Army, but none of those guys got down on their knees to talk to them face to face. And I found this just to be a very impressive reminder of how the Army thinks of these soldiers who took part in World War II. 500 years ago, the political philosopher Machiavelli wrote these words: "Though fraud and all other actions be odious, yet in matters of war it is laudable and glorious." The Ghost Army represents this powerful idea that you can harness art to help you in a time of war. And the men who carried out this mission came from 46 states and many backgrounds. You had artists from New York City alongside truck drivers from Tennessee. It was for many people the first time that they'd been exposed to people so different than themselves. Bill Blass said you could hear Beethoven's Fifth on one end of the barracks and Pistol Packin' Mama on the other end. And despite their differences, they came together to stage these astonishing battlefield performances. Then they went home and kept quiet about it for 50 years. So it's been one of the great honors of my life to meet these guys. On the left there, that is John Jarvie, whose niece was the person who first introduced me to the story. On the right, my wife Marilyn with Gil Seltzer. Gil was a veteran who lived to be 106 years old. He's only 103 in this picture. On the left there is Seymour Nussenbaum. He was the guy who made those patches. This is him the day of the gold medal ceremony. In the middle is Bernie Bluestein. He's still alive. On the right is Harold Flynn. He's passed away. I mean, look, these guys have become my friends, and then I've watched them depart one by one, and that's been hard. But I take heart in the idea that what I've done will help preserve the story of what they've done. The men of the Ghost Army were not textbook heroes, but they served with ingenuity, courage, and honor. They put themselves in the line of fire to fool the enemy and draw fire away from other soldiers so they might be able to fight and to live. And veteran Stanley Nance, again, I'll come back to Stanley, summed it up this way: if one mother or one new bride was spared the agony of putting a gold star in their front window, that's what the 23rd headquarters was all about. I think that's something Machiavelli would find laudable and glorious. I do, and I hope you do too. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Rick. We are going to take some questions. I have a microphone, so before you start, let me get to you with the microphone.
Were these rubber equipment and tanks and things used at Calais?
These were not used as part of the D-Day deception to make the Germans think we were landing in Calais. They had some inflatable landing craft for that deception, but the biggest part of that deception was turning the German operatives who were in England, the German spies who were in England, to have them transmit the information that the British wanted them to transmit. That's known as Operation Double Cross. And then creating the phony 1st U.S. Army Group with General Patton, and they had a radio team there that was pretending to send out signals. They didn't use inflatable tanks that much, despite what a lot of the books will tell you.
Thank you so much. That was really great.
Thank you.
Is there any evidence that the Germans ever came on to them? And
there's no evidence that I have found that the Germans ever realized that this deception unit was operating against them. And I think that that's really important, because if they had realized it, then they could have figured it out and utilized that. But I found no evidence of that whatsoever.
This is absolutely so fascinating.
I agree.
I know that you had mentioned your colleague who put together a screenplay. Is there any work that is being done to present this as a fictionalized story? Either a play,
There's a long answer and a short answer.
Okay.
And the sun is setting early, so I can't do the long answer. There have been attempts to make this a movie. Actually, the first attempt was in 1966. And the screenplay was written by Max Schulman, who was the creator of Dobie Gillis, okay? Richard wrote his screenplay, and yes, my book and documentary film were optioned. A screenplay was written, Universal Studios was behind it. Ben Affleck signed on to star and direct in it. Marilyn and I met with Ben Affleck. He told us that this was happening. And it didn't. And it didn't because of money. I don't know what, Richard, you could ask Richard afterwards. I don't know how many projects are not greenlit, but I'd say 1 out of 20 to 1 out of 50, maybe 1 out of 100, I don't know, are actually make movies. Every movie that gets made, there is a story of a miracle that happened there. There are people who are still interested now, but there's nothing much happening on it. But you know what? Stay tuned.
So how did they make sure that the real genuine units?
I'm sorry, where are you?
Hi, sorry.
Okay.
How did they make sure that the genuine units weren't discovered by the Germans when moving? Because obviously if the deception was too good, it would be obvious to the Germans that they were trying to be found. But how did the ones that were legitimately trying to go direction A and, you know, the Ghost Army was trying to
Sure,
make them
that's a
believe
great question,
direction
and
B?
I don't think anybody's ever asked me that question, but luckily I do know the answer. So the real units would have radio silence. They would wipe all the bumper markings off their vehicles, and oftentimes they'd be moving at night, and so you're just trying to completely do it in an invisible way while the fake unit is trying to get attention. If I can take a moment to tell a story that was told to me by a soldier named Jack McGlynn. He was a sergeant. He was leading a convoy of trucks in the 90th Division, and they were pretending to move in one direction. The real 90th Division is moving someplace else, and they're supposed to have taken all their bumper markings off. But now he and his trucks are moving through an intersection that's guarded by MPs who are from the real 90th Infantry Division. And they are suspicious because A, their vehicles aren't supposed to be marked. They're supposed to be unmarked now. B, who are these people? We don't know these people. So they say to Jack McGlynn, the guy says to Jack, he says, well, what's the password? Jack says, I don't know the password. He says, okay, what was last month's password? Jack says, I don't know any passwords. And of course, you can't tell him, right? You can't tell him that they're a fake version of the unit. But now the guy thinks, this is around the time of the Battle of the Bulge, he thinks he's caught some of these Germans who are dressed up in American uniforms, and he unslings his Thompson submachine gun, and he's going to point it at him, and he's going to ask him some questions. You see this in the movies. They always say, like, who won the 44 World Series or whatever? And I don't know. But he said, Cardinals. Yeah, okay. Go Cardinals. All right. What a place to ask that. All right. So he said, where are you from? And Jack said, Boston. And he goes, Boston's a big place. Where? And Jack said, Medford. And then he said, the guy really shocked him. He said, yeah? Well, what's the name of the school on Harvard Street? Of the 2 million people in the European Theater of Operations, he ran across somebody else from Medford. And he said he named that school, and then he lived, right? He wasn't shot. And after he died, they named a school after him in Medford, and it breaks my heart, because he was mayor, he became mayor of Medford. It breaks my heart that they didn't name that school after him, because that would be the perfect ending to that story. Anyway, I'm sorry, I saw the opportunity to tell that story, so I took it. Who's got the mic?
Yeah, I've got it here. Downstairs, there was just one display that spoke to what seemed to be the genesis of this at the very beginning, when Douglas Fairbanks was in England or someplace and got wind of some similar operation. And can you speak to that? Or?
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit. Douglas Fairbanks was involved in seeing what the British commandos were doing, and he came back and suggested, he was an officer at this point, he's Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and he suggested to the U.S. Army that they take up the idea of deception. He was involved in the early days of sonic deception, and out of his efforts come the Army's Sonic Deception Unit, but also come a unit that became known as the Beach Jumpers. You can Google them. And they mounted these big speakers in boats, and their idea was that they could pretend to be an invasion force gathering, again, the night before the invasion, in the dark, in the early morning hours, pretending to attack one beach when the actual invasion force is going to attack someplace else. Some authors who have written about this made a big deal out of Douglas Fairbanks, so I always felt I needed to put him in the book and he needed to be in the exhibit. He was a little bit periphery to the story of the 23rd, but he is involved in it.
Thank you. My biggest question was there any indication that these I know we know it now that all these deceptions worked and saved lives, but was there any indication at the time that they could see or visually see that the Germans would actually fall for these deceptions?
So there were some indications that the guys in the Ghost Army were aware of in deceptions where captured maps indicated that the Germans had bought what they were selling. Oftentimes they didn't know. One of the interesting things, and I think the jury is still out on this, is that I have heard that, Ultra, which is when we're reading the Germans' coded messages, right, from Bletchley Park, that there were Ultra excerpts from the German radio transmissions that suggested that certain Ghost Army operations had been very successful, but they were not shared with the people in the 23rd because they were not Ultra cleared. So, and that stuff was all kept so secret, and some of it still is secret. So I think that it may be that the higher ups at the 12th U.S. Army Group had a much greater awareness of the result of these deceptions than we really can prove right at the moment, and it may be that that's one of the reasons that this unit stayed in action and kept getting used over and over, because they had proof it was working. We want to do one or two more?
Were the Americans were doing this, the British were doing something like this. Were the Germans doing anything like this, and did we find out about it?
So the Germans certainly conducted deceptions. They did deceptions related to the Battle of the Bulge, but they did not have a dedicated deception unit like this one. They did not have this effort that involved, multiple home front factories making inflatables, making the speakers for the transmission, all that stuff. They just didn't. In fact, I've never found any other unit in the history of warfare that was sort of a dedicated, multimedia, mobile, tactical deception unit. The Army may have one now, but if they do, they are not telling me about it. I don't know why. So there really is something quite unique and unusual about this unit.
Rick, I know your flight's not until 9, but...
Right, we can stay.
We'll do a couple more if you got the stamina for it.
I can do more. I don't want to, I don't want people who are like, oh my God, I need to leave. They can, or if they want to start fighting their way for the books. But I'm happy to do a couple more questions.
Sure. Thank you.
How long did it take to set up the deceptions?
How long were the deceptions?
Like, how long did it take to set them up?
So I was told that they could set up an inflatable tank in 15 to 30 minutes. If you're setting up a few hundred of them, it depends on how many soldiers you have, but I would say that it would take a few hours. It generally would happen overnight. One of the interesting things is that these guys are all in Paris in September of 1944, and they get at noon on a certain day, their commander gets notice that they are wanted for a deception. He goes to the Allied headquarters in Versailles. He gets the details. They're going to have to go across France. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, they head out. At 10 o'clock, I think at 7 o'clock the following day, they arrive in Luxembourg, which is a few hundred miles away. They are now right on the front lines. They get there at I think it's 6 or 7 p.m. By 10 p.m., they are carrying out sonic deception. So, it can be a matter of hours to go from nothing to a full-blown deception happening.
Just to kind of the nuts and bolts.
Go for it, man.
Well, the displays that we have downstairs are kind of like bounce houses. We blow them up, and they have to. The only way they stay blown up is with some kind of ventilator. These things were rubber. How heavy were they? Obviously, they weren't real heavy because they could pick them up. But how thick was the rubber that these things were made from?
So the dummies weighed about 90 pounds. They were made out of neoprene. They were not one big inflatable balloon. What you have to imagine is that there's a skeleton of inflatable tubing. I think it was 2-inch or 4-inch tubing that makes the shape of the tank, and then it has a neoprene cover over that. Don't know the thickness of the rubber or the neoprene. But in the tubing, they had it segmented so that you have to inflate through multiple inflation points. And the reason that you do that is so that if a piece of shrapnel or a bullet hits one part of the tubing, it doesn't deflate the whole tank. It makes a hole that they can quickly repair and reinflate that part of it. They were carried in these large, oversized duffel bags, and as Jack Macy said, they had air compressors, which were gasoline-powered, to inflate them, but sometimes they didn't have access to those and had to use sort of hand-operated bicycle pumps. And sometimes at night they were a little nervous. If you're out near the front line and you're firing up your gas air compressor, it's a little bit nerving that you're going to attract enemy attention just by doing that. But that's some information about that. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Rick.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.